Today I'm speaking with David Oliver Smith. David, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, Tim.
Absolutely, it's my pleasure. And just to give a quick bio here before we get started, David Oliver Smith is an author, which we'll talk about in just a minute. I'll hold up his book shortly. But he lives in La Quinta, California, in the desert. He and his wife have 2 kids and 3 grandkids. He was a lawyer graduating from Duke Law School. He was raised Episcopalian. His father became an Episcopalian priest, and his brother was both an Episcopalian priest as well as moving into the Greek Orthodox side of things. In terms of his being an author, I've got one of your books. I do intend to get the others. This one's called The Bible Tells Me So, A Critical Analysis of the Jesus Myth. And so we are going to be talking about mythicism a little bit today. Just to give the other book names, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Paul, The Influence of the Epistles on the Synoptic Gospels, Unlocking the Puzzle, The Christology and Structure of the Original Gospel of Mark, and The Pauline Letters, A Rhetorical Analysis. Is it four books total?
Yes, that's right. That's right.
Okay, very cool, very cool. So I will add the link beneath this video for his page on Amazon. Please go check it out if you're interested. And I'll be asking some questions about that shortly. But before we get into the interview, I did want to just ask if you could to tell us anything else about your bio that I missed, and then maybe tell us about your hobbies or something fun.
I think you hit the highlights. Fun. I'm a big sports fan. I'm a Dallas Cowboy fan and a Duke basketball fan, and so it's a busy time of year for me watching all the games on TV these days.
Awesome. I will admit I've never gotten into that, but I've got a lot of family that does that. They'll spend a Sunday going from one game to the next.
Yeah, I watch with a bunch of old high school buddies. We text each other during the game. Oh, that was a terrible play. Oh, what a good play. Things like.
Nice. And in terms of, can you tell us, I'm just curious, the desert of California, I know I've seen like the pictures of the horrible traffic in the big cities like LA. I've seen pictures of the beautiful forests. I don't know too much about the desert part of California. Can you tell us about what it's like?
Well, if it weren't for the civilization, it would be nothing but rocks, rocks and sand. But there's an aquifer under the Coachella Valley, which is where we are, and you can bring up the water, and there are trees and golf courses. There are a huge number of golf courses out here, and gated communities and country clubs and all this. It's a real tourist area, and the tourist time has just started. November 1st to May 1st is the big tourist time, but in the summer it'll get up to 120. We don't want to go outside when it's 120, but
so everybody
anyway.
From like New York and Philadelphia and New England is coming over to get your warmth.
Well, yeah, mostly people from there are a lot of people from Canada.
Okay.
And then Washington, Idaho, Montana, like that.
Very cool. Well, in terms of the reason we're here, of course, we're going to do this interview just a little bit differently, just to preface it for everybody. Most of you who watch my channel know that my main focus is deconversion stories. This is going to be an interview about David Oliver Smith's book and his research. I have some questions for him, and we'll just go through what his book's all about. But before we do that, I'm going to just ask you to take a few minutes and just tell us about your spiritual journey. This will just be 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll get into your book. But where are you coming from with your worldview? How were you raised, and what were you taught to believe, and how did it evolve over time?
Okay, well, I was raised in Fort Worth, Texas. My family was fairly religious, raised in the Episcopal Church. And I was an acolyte when I was a teenager, and then I was in the church choir when I got into college, and high school and college. And so we spent a lot of time at church, but we're not fundamentalists. And I was never taught that the Bible was strictly true. We always interpreted it as allegory. And so I wasn't one of these fundamentalist types. And during high school, at least, maybe even junior high, I never believed the story of Jesus, the Jesus of faith. I thought Jesus was a real person. I thought that, but I didn't think he was raised from the dead or that he did all of these miracle healings or anything. I never took that seriously, even back in junior high and high school. I used to have conversations with my friends who were Southern Baptists. I didn't believe in hell. They couldn't believe I didn't believe in a hell. And they kept trying to argue me out of it. But anyway, so
That's crazy. So can I ask
so
real quick, did you believe in any kind of salvation? Like, was there any kind of, heaven and a way to get there? Or was it like a universal salvation? How did that work for you?
I assumed that there was some sort of heaven, but I never thought there was a hell. Just didn't make sense to me. And then I thought, as I said, I believed that Jesus was a real person, that he'd been crucified by Romans and like that, and had 12 apostles and started this religion. But then I was actually it was early 2000s. I had actually become a Buddhist in the late 90s, and I worked for Walmart. I was a tax lawyer with Walmart, and some of friends of mine in the tax department were fundamentalist types, and one of them asked me, "Have you ever heard of the controversy that Jesus might not be a real person?" I said, "No, I never heard that." And so I started researching the internet on Jesus being a myth, and I'll be darned. It doesn't look like Jesus was a real person. And so I got into it. Then I retired from Walmart in 2006. And so what am I going to do in my retirement? I was living in Arkansas then after retiring from Walmart. And so I started researching the mythical Jesus and whether he was really a historical person or not. Ran into Bob Price's podcast, the
Bible Geek.
the Bible Geek, and started listening to that. And then it occurred to me, I started reading the Gospels and and Paul's letters, and I said, "Gee, it looks to me like Mark is copying Paul's letters in order to have teachings of Jesus." And so I started looking into that, and then wrote my first book in 2011, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Paul, and showing how all three synoptic gospels used Paul in Jesus's teachings. And so that got me started. And so then here in 2022, I wrote this latest book, The Bible Tells Me So, which it's not a historical book. It's an interpretation of the New Testament that shows you where you get hints and clues that Jesus might not be a real person.
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic to me, and I think a lot of us would add, just in terms of our story, that those of us who deconverted, at least from the circles I've been talking to for a while, many of us got sucked into the idea that you're talking about through what some people would really consider, spurious and questionable research, such as the zeitgeist stuff. And a lot of people have done great work to try to clarify and say, this piece of that was correct, but this piece wasn't, or this is taking it too far. But it at least still introduces this idea that maybe he is another sun god, maybe there's more to this story. But it's been fascinating to me to see how this topic, which it is a really great thing to research, because there's a lot of evidence that there's so much legend involved with it. But even among atheists and agnostics who don't really care either way, there's so
Right.
much vitriol, uh, where even people that would say, I don't care either way. It's just a religion. I'm an atheist, but they even attack people who are mythicists because they don't want to, they see it as not solid research. And yet at the same time, they would readily admit that all over the place there's legendary stuff. They're like, this is legendary. That's copied from a Greek god. That's copied from the mystery cults. That's copied from this and that. And they'll add, they'll admit there's legend everywhere. And it's like, but he's a real guy. It's like, well, how much of this, can 95% of it be legend and he's still real? But it's fascinating to me how angry people get. And it's like, it doesn't have to be an angry topic. It's just a fascinating research topic. And at the end of the day, none of us really know for sure. And I don't think people on either side are really saying that they're like, I know for sure this is how it played out. But I think it does bring up a lot of interesting questions to say that if there's at least a chance that this was made up, that certainly for a lot of people would affect their faith very dramatically. And
Yeah.
there's a lot of evidence, in my opinion, that he may have been made up.
Yeah, I find the same thing that there are a lot of atheists that don't want to discuss the topic because they think it's off the wall, and so you're making an off the wall argument. I one time had an email argument with Earl Doherty on whether Mark used Paul's letters. He said, no, Mark couldn't have used Paul's letters, and I think I've got pretty good proof that he did, but anyway.
Yeah, it is. I love how there's really a lot of good work going on in this field. I mean, there's at this point, I'm overwhelmed with the number of books, everything from, of course, Dr. Carrier and David Fitzgerald to Earl Doherty and other people. Lots of great work going on. There's so
Absolutely.
many aspects of it. So, well, I appreciate you sharing your story. I did want to, I was going to ask you some questions if you had any kind of deconversion story, but you clearly did not. So we'll skip that. But again, I'm going to hold up your book here to kind of launch this part of the interview. Again, the Bible tells me so, a critical analysis of the Jesus myth. We're not necessarily going to stick in this book only. If we, touch on your other books, that's great. But I did want to I do have some questions for you, which I know I gave them to you in advance. I'll read them off as we get through it. But before I get to my questions, could you just tell us, in a few minutes, what would a reader see as they pick up this book? What's this book all about in a nutshell?
Well, actually, I started writing it because I thought that there was so much indication, especially in Paul and in Mark, that hint that Jesus is not a real person. And that's how it started out. And then I got more into it as I wrote it, more into it. And I found how Luke and Matthew edited Mark to maybe distort Mark's original story, and also that I had studied Robert Eisenman's theories on the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I had become convinced by Eisenman that Paul had been a member of the Qumran community. The people want to call them Essenes, and I'm not sure that they're really the Essenes, the same Essenes that Josephus is talking about,
Right.
because Josephus seems to say that they believed in a heaven, and I can't see that in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they had an afterlife, but no, where is that? And so the Qumran community, which I call in the book, may have been an offshoot of these Essenes or related to them, but don't seem to be exactly the same type of people. But anyway, it looks like Paul had been a member of the Essenes or the Qumran community, and had been an apostle, and then had become a traitor to them and had broken his oath. The council in the according to the community rule has to swear that they'll never teach anything or espouse anything other than Mosaic law. And so Paul broke his oath and became a traitor. And he's the one that's been called the Spouter of Lies in the Dead Sea Scrolls, in a number of scrolls. So once I started getting into that, and I thought, maybe I can outline the actual story of how Christianity began and how Paul invented Christianity and broke off from the Qumran Dead Sea Scroll community.
That's fascinating stuff. I love it. And there's so many ways we could take this, but let me dig into some questions here for you. And some of these you may end up, covering some of, an answer to a question I'll ask later. So we may get through some of these quicker as we go through it down the list. But first question I had was, could you talk about the cosmology of the ancient world with their different levels? What does it mean that the original crucifixion of Jesus might have been or could have been a celestial event only before being historicized in a sense? And could you elaborate on what it means for Jesus to have been only a celestial being who might have been crucified by demonic beings in a lower level of heaven?
Actually, Richard Carrier has a pretty good discussion of that in his book on the historicity of Jesus. But back in the ancient world, we've all heard of the term the seventh heaven. I was in seventh heaven. Well, back in the ancient world 2,000 years ago, the prevalent cosmology among educated people was that the planets revolved around the Earth, and each of the planets ruled a section of heaven, and there were seven planets. Well, that included the sun and the moon. They were considered planets because they revolved around the Earth. And so you had the moon, the sun, Venus, Mercury, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, and each one there was a level of heaven, and the lowest level, which was from the moon to the Earth, was populated with demons and unclean spirits, and was ruled by Satan or some
the prince of the power of the air.
Yeah, and so they're the ones who torment men on Earth. That's why life on Earth is so hard, because they're being tormented by demons and unclean spirits. Carrier has a really good discussion of a book called The Ascension of Isaiah, and this looks like that it's an early Christian text, and it describes Isaiah being transported up to the seventh heaven, and he witnesses Jesus being instructed by God to go to the lower levels, and so he goes down through each level, and Isaiah witnesses, and Jesus he has to say a password,
yeah,
to get into the new level. That cracks me up every time that Jesus has to give a password in order to get to the next level below. And when he says the password, then he's transformed into the kinds of beings that are in that particular level. And so he finally gets to the first level, and the demons are always fighting with each other and committing violence to each other. And so Jesus is, unbeknownst to the demons, that they kill Jesus, and then God resurrects him, and the demons say, "Oh no, we killed God! I mean, we killed Jesus. We didn't mean to do that." And it's an amazing book. And as I said, Carrier gives a really good description of it.
And you see some of those motifs in the Book of Enoch too. These levels of heaven, and going through it. Yeah, it's amazing. Once you get into these books of the Second Temple Judaism time frame, give or take, you really get to realize there's a lot more going on here. And without this background, you're gonna just miss all the little nuances that are woven right in the New Testament, and especially the book of Revelation and things like that, because they're this is what they were thinking of, but it's like you need a primer, you need something to explain to you what does this mean, and that's where, like you're saying, this ascension of Isaiah and other books really elaborate. There's a much different cosmology, and you can't just go in with our current cosmology and try to interpret it that way.
Yeah, absolutely. So anyway, that you have to be in that, as you're saying, you have to be in that mindset. You're going to miss so much of what the New Testament is saying.
Yeah. So what would the demons, if that's what happened, if that was the original understanding, why would they have crucified him, and why would that have been able to produce salvation for people, or why did they think it helped humans with their sin issue?
I'm not clear on that at all. That was if you for Paul's writings, it looks like God had this plan from the beginning of the creation that He was going to do this, and but how that's supposed to work is
Yeah, like it seems like it was some kind of ransom in some ways, like He was purchasing people through His blood. And it's interesting too that it's a bit of a cliche amongst atheists, but like this whole thing really does in many ways come back to, it's a human sacrifice, blood magic, death cult. Like that's what this is all about. It's just another version of it. And they had other dying and rising gods whose bodies and whose sacrifice meant so much, and especially their ability to be for many of them reborn or rebirthed or brought back to life or something, to come back from hell. But that somehow, as you identify with them, like that they did it first. They're the first fruits, as it were. They're the the firstborn of all creation. They're the person we look to as our model. But when we identify with them and become part of their story, even through things like the Eucharist, same thing like they did with Mithras, where you take the communal meal and you take the baptism and so forth, but you're identifying with your savior figure, and their salvation becomes part of your journey too. It's interesting. I wish I understood a little bit more about what they thought was going on there in heaven too, or the lower heaven, because it does seem like in some passages they're talking about the crucifixion, and it's very unclear, and it makes me think in a lot of them it sounds like they might be talking about an actual crucifixion, because there were real crucifixions.
Sure.
Why do you think that? Do you have a guess as to why they used crucifixion, since it was already a Roman motif that they were already doing, as opposed to just slit his throat or stick a dagger in his heart? Like why do you think they crucified him in heaven?
I don't know that there. Of course, Paul quotes from the Old Testament about if you're hung on a stick, you'll be cursed, and that in Isaiah 53 about being pierced.
Yeah.
And so one thing I need to make clear is that Paul and the Qumran community used pesher, and I think that it's really important to understand that Paul thought, and the Qumran community thought, of course, that they could read the Old Testament and glean a new meaning from it, and so Paul could read a passage, and then he said, "Oh, this is what God really meant." Now, in pesher, the way pesher is supposed to work, as I understand it, is that God inspires the Old Testament, and the Old Testament writer, whether it was Isaiah or Amos or Moses or whoever writing it down, he has no idea what God's purpose is. He's just writing what he's inspired to write, and God inspired him to write these particular words, and then at 2,000 years later or 1,000 years later or sometime, he's going to imbue someone with the ability to be able to see the real meaning of this. So Paul could read Isaiah 53. Isaiah is talking about the Jews being carted off to Babylon, and in Isaiah 53, it's not a prophecy of the Messiah, but Paul sees, oh my gosh, this could be about the Messiah, and so instead of Israel being the suffering servant, Paul sees that it's God's son that's the suffering servant. But yeah. Isaiah didn't know that. He wasn't making a prophecy. It's Paul who had the great idea.
It's almost like a Bible code, like the Bible code stuff that's going on in the last couple decades, where they're like looking for the read the first, like get the first letter and then get the 11th letter from that and the 11th letter from that, and then that makes up a word. And they're like looking for these codes, and people do it like for a full-time job, I think, trying to figure out some secret message. But it's like that idea, and it's different, but it's like this sense of like we've got a special way to interpret it now. And you also see with these what would you call rapture watchers of today, where people are like, we're waiting for the end times, and I know Jesus said no man knows the hour except the Father, that the end times are coming, but he still gave us all these signs. And when Israel attacked Palestine, last month or whatever, whenever this starts to happen, now we know this is the end. So we have like this new interpretation of what's happening, and everybody, it seems like every few generations they get convinced that they know how to interpret it better.
Exactly.
Well, going back to your main thesis, I wanted to just start to dig into some of that, just for my understanding, because a lot of this is new to me, but I do want to understand it because it's fascinating. The Jerusalem apostles, were they opponents of Paul, and did they believe in a different Christ who was not crucified?
It seems to me they did, and the main clues to that are in Galatians. But let me go back to it looks like, well, at the beginning of Galatians, Paul gives a thumbnail sketch of his ministry. He starts out with when he first had a revelation of Jesus as being the Son of God, and then he goes and visits Cephas, or Cephas, probably it's more likely Cephas, but most people call it Cephas, and James. It looks like to me he has decided to become a member of the Qumran community, and that he wants to volunteer to go, because he stays with Cephas for 2 weeks and doesn't meet anybody but James. Now James is this is according to Professor Eisenman. James is the teacher of righteousness, and of course Paul calls him the brother of the Lord. Paul doesn't want to say anything about James being righteous, because that's justification. He doesn't want to indicate that his opponents have anything to do with justification or righteousness. But anyway, so it looks like Paul is being recruited, or he volunteers to become a member of the Qumran community, and he stays with him for 2 weeks and finally convinces him that he's mended his ways, and he no longer persecutes the Qumran community churches, which Paul says that he did violence against. I'm not exactly sure what it was he's supposed to have done, but anyway, so Paul becomes a member of the Qumran community, and then he and becomes a member of the council. The community rule scroll tells about the council, and there's 12 members and 3 priests, and it's not clear from the Hebrew apparently whether the three priests are included in the 12 and there's only 12 or whether they're really 15. So it's ambiguous in the Hebrew as I understand it. I don't read Hebrew, or I'm not very good at Greek either, but I know a little bit. But anyway, so Paul becomes a member of the council and is apparently sent out in order to convert people to the Qumran strict Mosaic law, in order to prepare for the Messiah's coming. According to the Qumran community, the Messiah's coming just any time to set up what Paul calls the kingdom of God. They call it the Qumran calls it the new creation, and the Messiah is going to convert everybody to Mosaic law. And if you don't accept Mosaic law, you'll be killed. It's going to be sort of a violent world conquering. And so Paul goes out and spreads the word on this Mosaic law and apparently gets a better idea. I assume he's having trouble convincing Gentiles to be circumcised, but not
for sure.
And so, but anyway, he said we can make this more universal, and so he disputes the interpretation, the pesher of the teacher of righteousness. And he said, no, we don't have to follow Mosaic law. Christ was crucified, and all you have to do is have faith in Christ's crucifixion and atonement sacrifice, and voila, you get justified, you get saved. And so when Paul becomes, he starts converting people to his religion, and he's a traitor to the Qumran community. Well, that doesn't sit well back in Qumran, and of course they have financed this, because when you become a member of the Qumran community, you give all of your property to the community. So the community itself has to finance, and they do cover his travel expenses and probably any startup expenses for these new churches. But anyway, so
could I ask a quick question? When we say though that they believed, the Qumran community believed in a Christ who was not crucified, are you referring to the idea that they believed that there was a Messiah coming back, or a crucifixion wouldn't be part of it? He would just come from space with the angels to take over? Or did they actually, are you referring to an actual Jesus that they saw and worked with and lived with, and they just said, no, he's right here, he's not crucified, I can talk to him? Like, when we say there's two Christs in this story, I want to make sure I understand how are they seeing it on either side of it?
It seems like to me that what the Qumran group was doing was they were taking the Son of Man, the one like a Son of Man, from Daniel 7:13, 14, which doesn't mention anything about this Son of Man being crucified, but he is going to be have a kingdom that will have no end. Well, that sounds like the kingdom of God to me. It's a kingdom on earth, and the Son of Man is going to rule this kingdom, and it looks like it, and if you look at the war scroll in the Qumran community, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they're waiting for the Messiah to come. It looks like he's coming straight from heaven and going to lead this war against the infidels, and set up this kingdom that's going to have no end. And it's only implied, but Paul never has any disagreement with the with his opponents, with the Jerusalem apostles, about what's going to happen when Christ, when Jesus, when Messiah, when the Christ comes to earth. So I assume that they agreed on that part, because Paul never disagrees. He only disagrees with them on Mosaic law and whether that's sufficient for justification or not.
So they're not really believing in two Jesuses. Paul's just saying the Jesus that you expect to come, he is still coming. He did get crucified already by demons in heaven. And the Qumran community would have said, no, that didn't happen. He's just the Messiah up in heaven and he'll come down. So they're not really believing in two. Paul's not giving a different second Jesus. He's just saying there's more to the story that you haven't heard about. Is that fair to say?
That's a good way to put it. Exactly.
Okay. So he's filling in the missing chapters.
It's the same Jesus. It's when in 2 Corinthians 11:4, when Paul says these people are coming who preach another Jesus. Well, what's another Jesus? Well, really the only thing we know about Paul's Jesus is that he was crucified. Paul tells you nothing about Jesus, whatever happened to him. Well, he had a last supper, and he seemed to be poor in a lowly state of some kind. But the only thing you know from Paul is that Jesus was crucified and was resurrected by God. And so another Jesus must be one who wasn't crucified and had to be resurrected. So anyway,
I think I'm still struggling to understand how they're all seeing it. So if there was though no actual Jesus, going back to the mythicist position, if there was no actual Jesus, then the Qumran community wasn't saying we have been with Jesus. They're just saying we're waiting for him. We've never seen him. He's never been here. We're just waiting for his arrival.
You're right, okay. And that's clear from I think it's the Damascus document. Could also be in the community rule, where they say they're watching and waiting. They're on the tower waiting for Jesus to arrive, and they call it the visitation.
Why do you think they called him, if they were waiting for him and he hadn't come yet, why do you think they called him Jesus? Did you know why the name came into their minds?
Qumran never uses the term Jesus, although they do say that Yahweh saves, which of course is
same thing.
Or Yahweh's salvation. And so you get the name Jesus from what is it, Zechariah 6 and 3, when when he's clearly talking about the Messiah, and he talks about his name being Joshua or Yahshua.
Yeshua. Well, it does make you wonder a lot about what they were thinking. And I think what's hard about this too is just like you said, we know that there were other people preaching another Jesus, and a lot of it, of course, is lost to history. So you wonder, which are we talking about? One other Jesus storyline, or were there many? Because you look at the Gospel of Thomas, or you look at some of these other Gospels, and you get a sense, and the people have suggested there might have been not just like 50 or 60 Gospels, but maybe even hundreds originally. And you do begin to wonder, like, where are all these coming from? And of course, why don't we have them all? Who burnt the copies that we want to see still? But what were they saying, and why were people giving different versions of it? When, like, to me, I think one of the strengths of the mythicist position is, if Jesus was truly this real guy that the Gospels that we inherited say he was, that he came, he did all these miracles, he turned the world upside down. Even if he was, if just from a scientific perspective, that he was just a guy who did get killed, who was maybe did sleight of hand, he would look like a magician of sorts. Who knows? Maybe he was somewhat of a freedom fighter for some of the groups there. Maybe when it was 5,000 men coming with him to listen on the mountain, maybe they were people that were fighting with him. Maybe he was a fighter. Whatever it was, he was clearly an important person in that era, and yet nobody can agree on like what, apart from the religious texts, secular historians of the day don't have anything that they really can clarify and say, we can really tell you the explicit story of Jesus. They can do it for all these other people, and you get little snapshots that maybe this thing in Josephus is real, maybe it's an interpolation, maybe this guy's saying something, but maybe it's just more what he heard. But nobody like really clarifies. We can tell you, we have seen him. He did this, he did that, he showed up here. And it's like, when the only text you have is a text of faith, and there's multiples, and many of them have been destroyed, but it's clear that there were multiple Jesus being discussed. It does make you wonder just why is there no clarification here on who this guy actually was if he was so historical?
Right, exactly.
It's very, very confusing. Let me ask this: are there specific events that occurred in first century Palestine which are described in both the Dead Sea Scrolls and also in Paul's letters from different points of view? Like you mentioned, how there's somebody in the Dead Sea Scrolls that's spoken of as the teacher of righteousness and someone who's the liar. Is Paul picking up on some of these concepts and others like it from the Dead Sea Scrolls? So you could see in the Dead Sea Scrolls and think that's one topic, it's totally separate from Paul. But if you look deep enough, you'll actually see they're talking about sometimes the same thing from different perspectives. Is that happening?
Yeah, the Dead Sea Scrolls are just the ones we have anyway, seem to be obsessed with some guy which they call the Spouter of Lies, the jester, the man of lying. Has several terminologies. They never give a real name for him, just like they never give you the real name of the teacher of righteousness, who's the leader of the group. They just give you the code words, the Spouter of Lies. And you look at what the Spouter of Lies does, and you see, gee, that's kind of the same thing that Paul's doing. The Spouter of Lies teaches that you don't have to have you don't have to believe in Mosaic law or follow Mosaic law to be justified, to be righteous. The Spouter of Lies sets up churches based on blood. That can mean two different things. First of all, there's a crucifixion, which involves blood. And second of all, Paul sets up the Eucharist, which is supposedly drinking the blood, which is a huge anathema to Jews everywhere. You cannot drink blood. And so they have this guy setting up churches based on blood, and that's what Paul does. And then there also seems to be, to me, the way I interpret it, Eisenman didn't point these. Eisenman pointed those things out, and when he came to the conclusion that the Dead Sea Scrolls were talking about Paul, excuse me, but there seems to be a couple of instances in the Dead Sea Scrolls that are reflected in Paul's letters. In 1 Thessalonians 2:14 through 16, there's a disputed passage. A lot of people think that it's an interpolation. The majority of Pauline scholars thinks it's a total interpolation. In fact, they think it's from 2:13 to 2:16 is an interpolation. And then fundamentalist types think, no, it's original to Paul. But it looks like Paul is talking about a battle that's had between one of his congregations and his opponents, which he just calls the Jews. The same sort of battle is described in the Damascus document, where they talk about that the Qumran community was attacked by people who followed the Spouter of Lies, and they attacked back, and they imply that they killed some people, some of Paul, the Spouter of Lies congregants. So it looks like they're talking about the same incident, but from two different perspectives.
Yeah, and at one point, Paul was on the warpath. Before he was Paul. When he was Saul, according to Acts, he was on the
Right.
warpath killing people. So it does make you wonder if that's the same story.
I think a lot of killing went on back back then. It looks like to me. And also in Galatians 2, where Paul has the Jerusalem Council, where Paul and Barnabas and Titus meet with James and Cephas and John, and there seems to be the whole group of Jerusalem apostles is there, and Paul and the Jerusalem apostles seem to debate, according to Paul in Galatians, seem to be debating Mosaic law. Paul says he refused to let Titus be circumcised, and they must have had a debate for hours on end, because he says he did not relent even for 1 hour. So, how long was this debate? But anyway, so Paul was apparently disputing what the teacher of righteousness and the other Jerusalem apostles were saying about Mosaic law. And then in the Habakkuk Pesher, it talks about the Spouter of Lies disputing the teacher of righteousness interpretation of the Word of God. Well, that's what Pesher is. And whether they're talking about the crucifixion or not, we don't know. But it looks like the Habakkuk Pesher is reporting on that meeting also, and just like Paul, and this becomes, in my view, it becomes a split between Paul and the Jerusalem apostles. And then there's another instance. This could be a coincidence, but in the I think it's the community rule. The Dead Sea Scroll talks about cursing anybody who doesn't believe in Mosaic law. Well, that's just like in Galatians 1, Paul curses the people who do believe in Mosaic law. It looks like he is answering them, or they're answering him. It looks like that these documents are contemporary with each other, and they're talking about the same incidents. And now Eisenman doesn't point those out. He gives other instances of why he thinks Paul and the Spouter of Lies are the same person, but he doesn't relate the First Thessalonians and Galatians to things in the Dead Sea Scrolls. I found those.
It's fascinating too. You see the motif, and this isn't necessarily a huge argument, but you do see many times in Paul's epistles, at least the ones we have, that he does weave in this motif over and over of, I'm not a liar, I'm not telling lies, I'm not. And it's like, you're kind of, does I protest too much is kind of happening. You're protesting too much. All these people saying you're a liar, you're a liar. He's like, no, I'm not lying, I'm telling you the truth. And it's like, well, if you were telling the truth, or if no one was accusing you of being a liar, you're kind of going down that route a little bit too much of your own accord. But if he's responding to them and saying, you keep on making these accusations, and I'm telling you, I'm not a liar, I'm not the liar. They're the ones that are misguiding you, or telling you falsehoods. I'm the true guy. It's like they're just battling back and forth as to which one's going to win this. It's like it reminds me a lot of the conventions for president, when you get down to like the last 2 or 3 people. It's like we're all kind of on the same team. We all want God to win in the end. We want Yahweh to win. And clearly Paul and the Qumran community all wanted Yahweh to win this game in the end. He wants righteousness on the earth and so forth. So we're kind of on the same team, but it's like, when you're at that last, which one of us is going to be the actual candidate for the president, it's like all of a sudden everybody's at each other's throats. Like, that guy can't do it, that lady can't do it, she's going to mess us up. And it's like, I thought we were on the same team here, but they're just going at each other's throats. And it's crazy how it works out.
Exactly. Now Eisenman points out that Paul keeps insisting that he's not a liar. And if you look at the context, when Paul says he's not a liar, he's talking about, or there's a reference to his opponents in there. And so it looks like all of a sudden it came into his mind while he's writing about his opponents. Oh yeah, they call me a liar. No, I'm not the liar. I'm telling you the truth.
Exactly. And just one more comment before I go on to the next question. It's really interesting, like when I step back from this, regardless of whether Jesus was real or not, it's really fascinating just the idea that Paul, from all rationality, should have such a small part in the church's founding and the theology. That like the 12 people that Jesus picked, like they should have made up the bulk of the New Testament with their writing, whether they wrote it or, if they weren't educated enough that they dictated it to someone who could have. But, we should have seen all these letters and great gospels from the actual followers of Jesus who lived with him for years and sat under his tutelage. They actually saw him and they sat with him. They saw his crucifixion. And it's like you can see Paul's kind of taken over the show, or at least the version that we inherited. Paul takes over the show, and it never really, like, this wasn't enough to deconvert me for sure, but it always kind of didn't settle well with me to think, why was Paul such a big deal? Like there were 12 apostles, then Judas killed himself. They brought in Matthias at the beginning of Acts, so you still got 12 again. It's like, why is Paul even in this discussion? He's like this add-on, and the very fact that he is an add-on, and that when you finally get these passages where he comes to the official apostles who followed Jesus on earth, supposedly, he's just arguing with them left and right. And it's like, he doesn't really care too much to work with them or to listen to their opinion. And it's like, if he were truly, in my opinion, and this is just, a side conjecture, but if he were truly a man from God, where God is truly giving him the message and God is truly wanting to use him to turn the world upside down for Christ, when he got to the apostles, the real apostles, you would think he would sit there in humility and say, I heard his voice once on the road. I've talked to him for 2 minutes. You guys sat with him for a year or 3 years, depending on which gospel you read. You guys sat with this guy. Tell me, what else did he say? Because I don't know that much. But instead, he's basically like, screw you guys. You guys got it all wrong. It's like, that doesn't make sense. That doesn't sound right.
Exactly. Of course, the conventional Christian opinion is, well, the apostles didn't write anything because they thought the world was going to end just any time anyway. So there was no sense in writing it down. Nobody was going to know in 20 years. So that's why that's supposedly why they didn't write anything or wrote very little, or everything is a pseudograph.
Exactly. Exactly. Well, you've answered a few of my questions. I'm going to go on to one of the next questions that I've got here, because you're doing a good job of getting ahead of the game and answering some questions before I even get to them.
It's also intertwined with each other.
It is. So this is a clarification question. You kind of touched on this, but just to clarify quickly, in Galatians 2, Paul's meeting with the Jerusalem apostles. Was that basically the dissolution of their relationship, where they basically said, we got to part ways? We're not on the same team anymore?
That's the way I read it. And J.C. Bauer thought that also in his treatise on Paul that he wrote 1875, I think. Now, Acts tries to make it look like this meeting was a coming together, and all the apostles, Jesus's followers. Oh yeah, Paul, you're absolutely right. Mosaic law has nothing to do with this. Peter gives this long speech about how all you have to do is have faith, and what? Where did that come from? But anyway,
crazy.
And of course that was the conventional Christian view, but J.C. Bauer saw it as a splitting. Now he thought that Paul's opponents were just some offshoot of the, but not really James and Cephas and John, but some of the lesser apostles were his opponents that went around to Galatia and Philippi and Thessalonica. But anyway, yeah, it looks like to me Paul and the Jerusalem apostles have this long debate on Mosaic law, and then they never come to a conclusion. No one side convinces the other, and of course you're not going to convince anybody, right? You can't have a debate on religious ideas. No person ever going to convince anybody else. But anyway, so they finally just give up. Now, Paul does say they gave me the right hand of fellowship, which kind of seems like maybe they made up and everybody's all friends again. But I think the clue is he was going to go to the Gentiles and they were going to go to the Jews. They were going to split up the territory. No, we're not going to. This is a splitting of the ways, and Paul has to pony up some kind of contribution from his churches, from his congregations. It looks like he's paying them off and reimbursing them for all the expenses that they went through in subsidizing him on his when he was out being a traitor to him.
Yeah, and you really get the picture that, like, if you look at modern cult leaders, like really severe cult leaders with the personality cult, and they're just like, it's my way or the highway, and they're so willing to call everybody else a false Christian, false person. You know, we're the only people that have the real interpretation. You really get the sense that Paul fits in this category in many ways. He sounds a lot like an angry, but certainly dynamic, charismatic preacher who had his own interpretations and had his own vision for how this should all play out. And he basically was like, if you're not going to be with me, I'm going to just rampage over you. Like I will be the next, Billy Graham, as it were. Like if there was like a bunch of people being in the Billy Graham crusade for, when he passed, like, I'm going to be the next guy. Like, no, I am. And Paul's like, screw you all. I'm much more dynamic than you all. I will win this contest. I will be the next Billy Graham. And it's like, he just bulldozed over everybody. And in the end, he apparently won. And I mean, it seems like he won the story because most of the New Testament is his stuff, or at least in his name.
It looks like to me that Paul's letters are him trying to keep his churches in his group. And that's the purpose of the letters. In 1 Thessalonians, he says, congratulations on your election. It looks like they've elected to stay with Paul. And we find out in Romans that Thessalonica, the church in Thessalonica, did make the contribution and that Paul could give to the Jerusalem apostles to stay. But Galatia left the group, and that's why Paul in Galatians 3 says, "You foolish Galatians," because they're saying, "No, we're staying with the Qumran group," and so he's trying to convince them to stay with him. So it looks like that's what those letters are about.
Yeah, and it's funny when you're just looking at it from a deconversion perspective, which is what my channel is mostly about. The more that you look back on this stuff and I was an ultra fundamentalist. I was trying to be a preacher and a missionary. I was going to do tribal evangelism and church planting, but I mean, I was in it. I went to Bob Jones and another conservative school. I was really neck deep in this. But when you look at this stuff, and you step back and you think of where were the red flags that I should have seen? Like, what were the things that should have been a big deal, but weren't? And you do look at these texts of Paul. And of course, there's always going to be a preacher that's going to say, oh, this is still inspired. It's, it sounds like it's of that time, but this, God inspired it. And it's got principles that are timeless, of course. But when you really look at it and you stop looking at it through the eyes of faith and you just say, there is so much contention here. Paul he seems like he preaches grace, and obviously like in Romans and other places, Ephesians, but he's one of the most graceless characters you come across. And even like John Mark, John Mark abandoned him, and he's like, screw John Mark, whatever. And he eventually later says, John Mark is actually going to be useful to me in the ministry. So, bring him, or whatever he says. But it's like, earlier on, he's ready to just write people off. He's telling even Barnabas seems like the nicest character ever. He's just like so wonderful. He's like a breath of fresh air in the story. And he's like, they still have to part ways. Like, if you have to part ways with someone like Barnabas, I'm sorry, there's a problem. It's like, it's like parting ways with Andy Griffith. It's like, come on, he's the nicest guy on the planet. How can you possibly argue with him? But Paul's like arguing with everybody he can. And it just,
Right.
the more that I look back, I think this should have been red flags. I mean, amongst arguably thousands of red flags. But this issue of who is Paul and what is he doing arguing with everybody on the planet in that group, that should have been a red flag. This doesn't sound right. It sounds like a severe cult leader with a personality cult.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I do want to ask you a slightly different question next to take it into some of the more details of your book. What is the term spearman rank order correlation? That's a big phrase. I don't know what that means. Didn't even know what it meant before I read the book. But for anyone else like me that didn't know, what is a spearman rank order correlation? And then as you define it, what happens when you do perform a correlation like that on the passages common to the synoptics? And does that help us confirm if Mark was the first written gospel potentially?
Well, I think so. A Spearman rank order correlation is you can take a population that has two different attributes, and you can rank order them and see how one attribute correlates with the other. For instance, let's say you wanted to compare the income level, the per capita income level of the states of the United States with educational achievement, however you want to define educational achievement, number of PhDs or number of schools or whatever. And so you rank order every state. This state has the first most, is the highest income. This is the next highest. This is the next highest, and then you make the list. Well, that state in educational isn't one, it's three, and the second one isn't two, it's seven, and then you rank order, and then you perform a mathematical formula on them. You subtract one from the other, square it, and then do something else, I believe. But anyway, and you come out with a coefficient of correlation. You can tell how well they correlate. If it's a one-to-one correlation, you get a coefficient of correlation of 1. So number 1 in this category is number 1, in that category number 2 is number 2, number 3 is number 3. Then you get a correlation, a coefficient of correlation of 1, and then lesser, it will be lower than 1. And so what I did, first of all, my undergraduate major was psychology, so I had to take statistics for psychology papers. So I knew something about statistics, and I realized I could do this rank order correlation with the triple tradition, all of the passages that are the same or similar. They're not exactly the same in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. That's in the Synoptic Gospel. So they have what's called the triple tradition. They all have some form of this passage, and some are real short, like the first should be last, and the last should be first, and some are entire pericope, like maybe the raising of the paralytic. Or something like that. Sometimes they're long, but I found, I believe it was like 157. I divided it into 157 different passages, and so I found what order in the gospel does it come in, and this is Jesus is baptized first, and then this happens, and this happens, and this happens, and so I compared Matthew with Mark, and Luke with Mark, and Matthew with Luke to see how well they correlated. And let's see, Matthew has a correlation of like, I think, what, 0.89 with Mark. That's extremely high correlation. Well, you can imagine, you're telling a story, it has a plot line, and so the events are going to come in relatively the same order. Now, Matthew moves some of Mark's sayings into the Sermon on the Mount, and so they get out of order there. And then Luke has a correlation of I'm forgetting what that, but Luke has here it is. Luke and Mark are correlated at 0.94. That's even higher than Matthew and Mark. But Matthew and Luke only correlate at 0.79. So it looks like that Matthew and Luke were both copying Mark and not copying each other. Although you could say that Matthew and Luke copied each other with respect to the double tradition, to what's called the Q.
Yeah. So with all that work, you end up concluding that Mark was likely the original gospel. How does that help at all in the discussion of the question of mythicism? Is it possible that Jesus was just a made up character? What does Mark being first do to help us in that discussion?
Well, what that means is, if Mark is fiction, if it's an allegory and it's not based on history, then since Matthew and Luke both copied Mark, they have to be fiction also. Now, you can't do this with John. John is somewhere else, got his stuff somewhere else, except he does follow the same pattern. It looks like he used the same storyboard, but
he was smoking the good stuff though when he wrote his.
Yeah. Well, he had to put in all the signs for his signs gospel. but I
just say that because I know he was in a lot more of Dionysius, which makes me think he was smoking and drinking some of the good stuff. he seems addicted to bringing in Dionysius into the story. Anyway,
the white liquid. Yeah. So if Mark is fiction, then Matthew and Luke have to be fiction, and you can't say that there are three sources or four sources that show Jesus as a historical person. No, it's all one source. They're copying the same source.
Yeah, exactly. So, sticking with the topic of Mark, what is a Markan sandwich? The Markan sandwich technique, and how did the author of Mark use it in regard to the order of his sources?
Well, this is really complicated. I don't know if I can get it across and just talking about it.
Well, you can maybe tease us and make us go buy your book.
Yeah, exactly. Well, first of all, what I realized, and this is based on an article that Bob Price did 20 years ago, where he talked about how Mark seems to be a midrash on Old Testament passages. I started looking into it and following up on Bob, and I found every event in Jesus's life, according to the Gospel of Mark, is based on an Old Testament source.
Yes.
And every teaching of Jesus is based on Paul's letters. I've got a proof of that. You might not know whether Paul came first or Jesus came first, and Paul was really quoting Jesus, but there is a proof of that in Mark. But anyway, so if Mark is using the Old Testament, I started looking at that, and I noticed a strange phenomenon, that occasionally there'll be two consecutive stories in Mark that are based on the Old Testament, and the stories in the Old Testament are consecutive, but they're reversed. They're flipped. Mark flipped the order of the stories. For instance, there's Jesus goes up on the mountain and appoints the 12 apostles, and then the next story is Jesus is preaching in a house, and his family come to get him because they think he's out of his mind and they're going to take him away because he's gone crazy doing all these things. Well, those come from the stories of Moses in Exodus. First, well, I ought to say that when Jesus' family come to get him, Jesus rejects his family and says, they're not my brothers and sisters. The people who gathered around me and listening to my word, they're my brothers and sisters. But
so respectful to his own mother.
exactly. But in Exodus, Jethro brings Moses' family to see him, and Moses is delighted to see his family and runs up and kisses them and has a big dinner, which is the opposite tone from the Markan story. But you can tell that it's based on that. And then Jethro suggests to Moses that he appoint lesser judges to take all these minor cases, so Moses didn't wear himself out. So these stories that Mark seems to have based his events of Jesus' life on are in the opposite order from the way they appeared in the Bible, in the Old Testament, I should say. Well, there seems to be 10 of these reversed sources, consecutive stories, but Mark has reversed the sources. Well, for centuries, Markan scholars have known about a Markan sandwich. A Markan sandwich is when Mark starts a story, story A, then he interrupts it and tells a story B, and then he finishes the story A. He, as they say, he intercalates story B in between the text of story A. So a good example of that is when Jesus is going to raise Jairus's daughter. Jairus asks Jesus or tells Jesus that his daughter is sick, and he needs Jesus to come help heal her. And so they all start going to Jairus's house to see the daughter. And then all of a sudden, this woman who's been flowing blood for 12 years touches his garment, and she's instantly cured. And Jesus says, who touched me? And the woman confesses, and he says, go on your way, your faith has cured you. And then they finish the story. He goes and sees Jairus' daughter. She's died by this time, and he raises her from the dead. He said, oh, she's just sleeping, and raises her from the dead. So that's a Markan sandwich. Now, Markan scholars universally recognize that there are 6 Markan sandwiches. Then there are 3 others that are disputed in the literature. So there could be a total of 9, but some deny that it's really not clear. Interestingly enough, as I was looking, I found a reversed source. and I said, there should be a Markan sandwich near here. And I found the 10th Markan sandwich that no Mark scholar has ever found before, which is right at the beginning when after John baptizes Jesus, Jesus goes into the wilderness. That's the intercalated story, and then John is taken prisoner by Herod. Now it's only like 4 words long, so you might miss that this is the rest of the John story. So that's why it's been missed all these years. But anyway, what I discovered was these Markan sandwiches are on top of or adjacent to Mark's reversed sources. There are 10 of each, and they're real close together. There's 5 in the first half of Mark, and there's 5 in the second half. There's 1 at the beginning of the first half, then there's a space where there's no Markan sandwiches, and then the other 4 come fairly quickly. And then there's 1 at the beginning of the second half, then there's a space where there's no Markan sandwiches, and then there's 4 that come fairly rapidly in chapter 14 and 15. So Mark did this pattern and associated these Markan sandwiches, which all Markan scholars recognize, but he did it in conjunction with, associated with, these reversed sources with the Old Testament. Well, there's one from Paul, and there's one from Maccabees, which is not really in the Jewish Old Testament. But anyway, what was Mark doing? I don't know what his purpose was in doing that, unless he's trying to call attention to the reversed sources. He's showing his readers, his sophisticated readers, look, these are coming from the Old Testament. This is an allegory. This is not true. Maybe he was doing that.
It's interesting that even Paul talks about, like, the Old Testament in Galatians. He talks about Hagar and the children Isaac versus Ishmael, and he's like, this is an allegory. And Paul even is looking at stuff as an allegory, and the idea that Mark wouldn't be doing the same thing is very much a stretch.
Yeah, but this is a strange construction that Mark came in, that I discovered, that I don't know exactly what he was doing. My wife suggests maybe he was trying to cut out interpolations or redactions that it would get messed up if somebody did an interpolation, and he's trying to make so you can tell what the original gospel was. I don't know whether.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It does lead you to wonder too. Again, I'm kind of one of those, like, I kind of like to dive into a little topic and a bit of a detailed look at something. And then I like to step back and kind of say, what does this mean? What does this tell us? Like, even though we don't know for sure how to conclude about this topic, what does this tell you? And I think, looking at it from the mythicist perspective in the very biggest sense, and I'll keep this short before I go to my last few questions, but like when you look at Mark, who is using Pesher and Midrash and all this stuff, and taking the Old Testament stories and rewriting them clearly, Jesus, even Paul does, Jesus is the new Adam, but he's clearly making Jesus the new everything, the new Israel, just like Israel went through the water and then was in the desert for 40 years. Jesus is in the desert, or goes to the water of baptism. He's in the desert for 40 days. It's clearly a new Israel, clearly a new, Moses, a new David, new Joshua, all this stuff. But then when you add in the other stuff that's copied from, such as the great work of Dennis MacDonald, showing it's copied from the Homeric epics, and things like that from the ancient world of these great poems that everyone knew. Well, you can clearly see they're copying from that to weaving it into the Mark story. But then you also see clear examples where they're copying it from the other Greco-Roman pantheons, where they're clearly carrying across motifs. And then even things like they're clearly trying to weave in things relating to Plato. We know where Plato writes the great work Timaeus. Well, who's the blind guy that Jesus heals? The son of Timaeus. Like, you're weaving in all these motifs, and it's
Right.
like, okay, this is clearly legendary, not just legendary, like, oh, Jesus, healed one guy, so we're going to say he healed 300. They're not just stretching the truth, they're just making shit up based on their copying from the other stories, but they're clearly doing it in a um, very educated way. I mean, arguably, these are guys who've been spending some time in Alexandria, Egypt, or one of the other great libraries of that world. They've spent some serious time in the great works of history, but it's clear they're just rewriting stuff that everybody already knew, and at least the educated would have picked up on. And that's where, when I step back from this, I find it really difficult to listen to atheists, and some of them are even I consider them my colleagues, where I'm like, we're kind of doing the same thing, but I'll hear them saying there's just no way that the mythicist position has any weight to it. This is completely got holes in it everywhere. But yet they'll say this is clearly copied from the Old Testament, from Homer, from the Greco-Roman gods, and so forth, Egyptian gods. And it's like, okay, well, how can it be copying from so many things and rewriting it all? And yet it's real. Like, eventually you have to say, this is clearly a made up story. It's brilliant. I'll admit it's brilliant. I mean, you have to be really
Yeah.
smart to weave together the Old Testament to that level. All these other sources I just talked about, you can't be an idiot. You have to be very well educated, but they're clearly doing that. So why would we conclude, after having learned all that stuff, learn that that's what they've been doing? That's the background of how they came up with this stuff, to say, but he's a real guy. It's like, it doesn't follow to me. There's at least got to be a possibility when you have that much copying from other sources. Like, if he did his own stuff, you wouldn't need to copy from other sources. Just tell us the real stuff that he did. The fact that you
Yeah.
have to go to other sources to fluff up the content, it's like, well, either he didn't do much and it's much ado about nothing, or there wasn't a guy in the first place and you're truly just making him up, which is what I do. I the more that I go into this topic, the more I'm leaning more and more to mythicism. Again, you can't really land on it because no one knows what really happened back then, but just saying what's more likely, it does seem more likely that they just made this up.
Absolutely. I agree 100%.
Well, keeping the ball moving then, in the original Mark, is it correct to say that Jesus did not realize, the Jesus character did not realize that he needed to be crucified before he could become the Christ, and that he was informed of this, that he would be the Messiah by way of dying first, the violent death of the cross, that Moses and Elijah announced this to him or informed him of this at the Transfiguration? So he was just like a great teacher, preacher, but they're kind of saying, you're going to become something much greater, and this is how you're going to have to sacrifice yourself to get to the greater, whatever, that the greater glory. Is that what's happening, do you think, in Mark?
Yes. Well, first of all, in my book, Unlocking the Puzzle, I tease out the original Gospel of Mark. What we've got, canonical Mark, is a redacted version of the original Mark, and I match passages in Mark with other passages. He did large chiastic structures in Mark, like the first half of Mark, or the first part of Mark, the baptism, forms a chiastic structure with the passion. It's in reverse. You can see what happens at first. The splitting of the sky matches the splitting of the temple veil. Jesus crying out matches the voice from heaven, and all that, and it goes step by step. There are like 22 matches between the first half and the second half, and then some of the internals also match up, and you can find out. I found out what the original Gospel of Mark looked like, and the interesting thing is, there's only one feeding miracle in the original Gospel of Mark. And of course, the canonical Mark has two feeding miracles. He feeds the 5,000, then he feeds the 4,000. Well, what a redactor did, it was extremely clever. He took that feeding miracle, the one feeding miracle, and split it. He wrote a new ending to the first half and a new beginning to the second half that kind of match each other. The same sort of stuff happens. And then he filled in everything at the end of Mark 6 and the beginning of, some of Mark 7, the Sino-Phoenician woman daughter is an interpolation. He interpolated all that to make Mark longer. But you can take those out. Now, Jesus' controversy with the Pharisees over eating, that should be in Jericho in Mark, like 10:46. But Mark 10:46 says, and they came to Jericho and they left Jericho. And what? What happened in Jericho? Well, Mark 7:1 through 25 happens in Jericho. If you put that in, it fits in and it matches other things in Mark. But anyway, so
that's crazy.
What should happen is the transfiguration in Mark in original Mark came much earlier in the gospel than 9:2, where it is now. The redactor moved it and the next pericope following that. But anyway, once you get the Mark in the right order and you see what the plot Mark has, then you see Jesus is tempted by the Satan in the wilderness, but you don't find out what happened to him. How was he tempted? What happened? Well, Matthew and Luke have a long 3-part test that Jesus passes with flying colors, but not in Mark. He was tempted. Did he pass? Did he fail? What happened? And then when you read the Transfiguration and Peter's identifying Jesus as the Christ at Caesarea Philippi, you start putting this all together. Oh, wait a minute. And also the way Jesus uses the term Son of Man when he's identifying himself as the Son of Man, supposedly the one like a Son of Man. It looks like to me, Jesus believed at the beginning of the gospel that he was already the Messiah. He was already the Christ. He was the one like a Son of Man who had come to earth to set up the kingdom of God. After the wilderness, he comes into Galilee and says, "The kingdom of God is at hand." Well, I think he means, and I'm leading it, and I'm setting it up. and so when he uses the term Son of Man in the beginning of the gospel, first he says the Son of Man has authority to forgive sins, and then that's in Mark 2, and then at the end of Mark 2, he says the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Well, he has authority and he's Lord. Then you come to the Transfiguration, and he meets with Elijah and Moses. You don't find out what they tell him, just like you don't find out how Satan tempted Jesus. These are unreported conversations. And what did they tell him? Then all of a sudden, right there in the Transfiguration, Jesus has merged the Danielic one like a son of man with Isaiah's suffering servant. All of a sudden now, every time he mentions the Son of Man, it's in conjunction with either suffering, being killed, or coming on the clouds in glory after the parousia. So the whole attitude of Jesus about the Son of Man changes at the transfiguration. I'm not the first one to notice this. There's another Markan scholar had that. I've forgotten his name now. I'm sorry, I've lost his name. But anyway, it was noted that this guy noted Jesus has a change of attitude about the Son of Man after the transfiguration. Of course, he thinks the transfiguration's at 9:2 when it ought to be at 6:31. But anyway, so it looks like Jesus is confused as to his mission. He thinks he's already the Messiah. He's the Danielic one like a son of man. How did he get confused? Well, he was tempted in the desert by Satan. Somebody told him something, but then God discovers that Jesus is confused, and he sends Elijah and Moses to the transfiguration, and they tell him, no, you're not the Christ yet. You've got to be crucified and resurrected before you become the Christ, and that's your lot. How did he know that was Moses and Elijah? Did they have a name tag? Hello, my name is Moses. But anyway,
that's crazy.
But so it looks like, and that makes a much better plot. It's a much better story, the allegory story of Jesus, that he's when you're writing. I've taken courses in writing movie scripts, and I actually have been an actor in the past. I've taken acting lessons and learned how scripts work and how stories evolve. I was never in anything you'd ever heard of, but anyway, in a movie script, movie scripts are typically about 100 pages long, and it takes 90 to 100 minutes to do a basic movie. By page 30, you need to have what's called the inciting incident. Well, no, I'm sorry. In the first 10 pages, you need the inciting incident. That sets the plot in motion. That tells the protagonist what his goal is, what his mission is. Okay, well, we've got that. Jesus is going to set up the kingdom of God. We get that by Mark 1:14. By page 30, you have some major impediment to accomplishing that goal in a movie script. Well, a third of the way through Mark, if I'm right, and you're supposed to move the transfiguration up to Mark 6:31, all of a sudden there's a major impediment to his setting up the kingdom of God. He's got to be crucified and resurrection, and he's got to have faith in God that this is going to work.
Yeah. Well, it brings up
major plot point.
It brings up to me too the idea that for so many of us who were stuck in this, religion as our bread and butter, as this was the actual word of God and infallible, that we didn't really have a scope for the imagination. I use that phrase a lot, but just the idea of saying maybe things were interpolated, maybe things were in a different order, maybe there was an earlier version, maybe it evolved, maybe scribes got involved at certain points. But by the time we get our version, that we've inherited. And in some cases we can tell we still have multiple versions, like the what is it, the nine different endings of Mark that we have, but you get enough of this sense that like this doesn't look like what it would look like if this were written by a God who is extremely brilliant beyond our wildest dreams, mathematically brilliant, artistically brilliant, the smartest character arguably that we could ever imagine. He wrote this book. Well, no, this looks like humans kind of messing around with the script. It's exactly what you'd expect if humans did exactly that, you'd get exactly what we get. In addition to the issue of it doesn't look very well preserved. It looks like this, who knows, what the earlier version was, and who knows if there was a different version that we could have gotten, but we didn't because somebody said, no, let's go back to version, 2.0 instead of 3.0. And that's what we get. We got 2.0. But that's what they wanted us to have. The idea that there were people controlling the narratives for different reasons and trying to rewrite it to make more sense. It makes so much of a better story when you're looking at it from a historical perspective to say, that's exactly what this looks like. And it's fascinating to try to dig into what could have been the original and how could it have evolved, regardless of how it did evolve. And we don't know for sure. It's all conjecture, but regardless of it, if there's evidence that that's what happened, it helps people who are trying to escape to say, this doesn't look divine. It looks like a man-made book. And it looks like multiple men were writing and editing and evolving this book. And I think it really does help you to, whether you think that there's an original Jesus that they had in mind or not, if there was a historical guy that was behind this all, it makes you realize that we are looking at a book that doesn't look divine. And so for anybody that was stuck on this, like, oh, this is the perfect word of God, I think these discussions at the very least help us to understand, have a scope for the imagination. There's a lot more going on here, and we're just using the tools that we have for the evidence that we do have to make conjecture. But there's also arguably a whole bunch of stuff that got buried or burnt or destroyed that we don't have. This story probably would have, I think we could make a good case that there is a whole bunch more here that we're just never going to know. And
absolutely.
I think it just helps people like myself to say, this is not what we thought it was. So regardless of where you land on mythicism, don't get stuck up on this idea anymore of the Bible being the word of God. It's just not. It looks like the word of men.
Exactly.
I did have another question here, a few more here before we wrap up. The next one will probably be a quick one. How was Peter's declaration in Mark 8 that the pre-crucified Jesus was the Christ? How is that set up in the original configuration of Mark, most likely?
It looks like to me that the Markan redactor wanted to make that the turning point of the gospel. Before that, in the original Mark, which I think is your question, in original Mark, Peter is wrong. He's not the Christ because he hasn't yet been crucified yet. He hasn't been resurrected yet, and that's what Jesus says. He says no. Mark is very vague. You can read anything into Mark you want to, and it's done by design, I think. But what I think Jesus is telling Peter after he says you're the Christ, no, I've got to suffer and be killed and raised after 3 days, and then everything's accomplished, or something words to that effect. Then he's the Christ. But that's never the way it's interpreted. Well, the Markan redactor saw that, and also Matthew and Luke saw that. But the Markan redactor moved the transfiguration to come after that, to make it look like Peter knew what he was talking about, and that Jesus was the Christ all along, and he knew he was the Christ all along. But in the original Mark, Peter is wrong, and then after Jesus says that he has to be crucified, Peter says something to him, and we don't know what he says. He rebukes Jesus or admonishes him. And then Jesus admonishes Peter and says, "Get behind me, Satan. You're thinking of the things of men, not the things of God." What does that mean? Well, that relates back to the temptation of when Jesus was tempted by Satan. Jesus has found out that Satan tempted him into thinking he was the Son of Man and already the Christ. So Peter's fallen into the same trap. So, but you've got to get all this stuff in the right order and see what Mark was doing. See what does this mean? Why would Jesus call Peter Satan if he correctly identified himself or identified him as the Christ? It makes no sense. And now they say, and then Matthew changes, "Oh, Peter, God told you this, and I'm going to found the church on you. You're the rock of my church." What? No, that's not what happened, according to Mark.
And the way that Jesus is so rough with Peter, when Peter's obviously, he's portrayed over and over as kind of a buffoon that, puts his foot in his mouth, and he's kind of, slow-witted to try to, remember, "Oh, Jesus, you've done these miracles, but now what are we going to do?" Now, it's like as if he forgets that Jesus is all powerful. He's kind of this idiot character over and over in the Gospels. And so when he finally says something this big, like, "But that's stupid," like, Jesus, of course not. Instead of Jesus correcting him, he's going to call him Satan. It's like, if you were really the most gracious character in, in heaven and earth, and you understand that this person is just slow and foolish and dumb-witted, and they're trying their best to follow you in every sense, and they're just hanging on your every word, and they make one mistake, you're not going to chew them up. You're going to say, "Hey, I get it. You're trying your best. I'm not going to call you some wicked name like Satan. Let me tell you though, there's some things you don't know. Let me educate you." He doesn't, Jesus doesn't have to turn into a jackass to Peter to correct him there, but he does, and it's another red flag that this guy isn't, who we were told he was in church. Can I ask the? I'm sorry,
Mark's Jesus is a human. Mark's allegorical Jesus is a human. He gets mad and he gets angry and spiteful, but he's never supposed to be a God or a Christ while he's on earth. He's a fallible human being like the rest of us.
Yeah. And arguably he, the more you look at the Jesus character without the eyes of faith, without the rose-colored glasses, you really realize in many ways in the Gospels, he was not a nice character. I mean, calling women dogs, all kinds of stuff that he does. It's endless, and it's crazy that we were so enamored by this character. He's quite the jerk. But next question: how does the Gospel of Mark's allegory about Jesus relate to the story of Paul's development of Christianity and his possible assassination in Jerusalem? Does that make sense?
Yes, I know what you're talking about. Well, this is really speculation on my part. But I was reading Mark, studying Mark, and said, why did Mark set this gospel in 36 AD, 36 CE, whatever you want to call it? It looks like he's trying to make it historical. It's obviously an allegory. He obviously knows it's fiction, since he got all his stories out of the Old Testament. What is he doing? And then I realized that if you interpret 2 Corinthians, where Paul says he left Damascus when Aretas was had control of, or was an ethnarch in Damascus, that could have been in 36 AD. Is he talking about Paul? Is that the reason Mark set this thing in 36 AD? Because Paul left Damascus in 36 AD and joined the Qumran community, joined the Jerusalem apostles in 36? Huh, isn't that interesting? And then you start looking at these things, and how does the Gospel of Mark start out? It says, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, Son of God. Who in the world would write the first sentence in the book, the beginning? You know it's the beginning because it's the first sentence you got to. He's telling you that this is the story of Christianity. That's what that means. This is the history of Christianity. And he starts out with Isaiah talking, or on the mountain, Elijah talking about I'll send out my apostles. Who's the greatest apostle of everybody? Paul. Is this the story of Paul? Really? And then I started looking at it, and I interpret the messianic secret. Paul is keeping his justification by faith theology secret from the Jerusalem apostles, from the people who could call him on the carpet and maybe kill him for it. If you'll notice in the messianic secret, people never mention this when they talk about the messianic. They say, "Oh, Jesus is always telling people not to mention him to anybody. Don't tell about the." No, it's only in Hebrew areas that he talks about that. If you're in a Gentile area, if he's in the Decapolis, go tell what wonders that God has done for you, and you don't keep it a secret in the Gentile areas. You only keep it a secret in the Hebrew areas. So, the messianic secret may be Paul keeping secret his new theologies, keeping it secret from his overlords in the Qumran community, and then I finally made sense of Jesus and the Gerasene demoniac. I never could. What the heck is this about? Why do these unclean spirits go into the pigs and they run off the edge? Well, this is Paul in Greece figuring out that you can't have circumcision if you're going to sell a religion to Gentiles. But anyway, if you go through and you can relate all these things that happened to Jesus as happening as what happened to Paul in his trying to formulate his justification by faith theology and spread it. And finally, you get to Jesus coming into Jerusalem, riding on a donkey and being praised. Where in the world did that come from? We've had nothing but controversies, and all of a sudden people in Jerusalem who've never seen this guy, who never heard from him, are singing songs and putting palm fronds in front of him as he's coming in through the gate. Where did that come from? Well, it makes no sense. Well, it seems to me it's Paul's triumph in getting the collections from Corinth and Thessalonica and Philippi, and he's bringing the contribution back to the Jerusalem apostles, and he's going to get them off his neck. And then I said, the crucifixion of Jesus must have something to do with the death of Paul. Nobody knows how Paul died. Paul just disappears from history. and various church fathers speculate Paul died in Spain, or of course, Acts suggests that maybe Nero killed him, and there's various documents saying that Nero cut Paul's head off or something. But maybe the Jerusalem apostles finally got tired of Paul, and even though he brought them the contribution they were looking for, they stoned him to death at the in Jerusalem when he came. There at the end of Romans, where Paul is telling the Romans that he finally got his collection together, and he's going to take it to Jerusalem to his opponents. He says, "Wish me luck," and it looks like he's afraid something might happen to him. And it's speculation. You can't figure this stuff out, but it looks like the Jerusalem apostles may have killed Paul. Then there had to be a cover up of that. If the Pauline church wanted to merge with the Qumran church, and this would be after Jerusalem was conquered by the Romans, and the Qumran community probably went to Arabia.
So you're saying that basically that the Qumran community was expecting a Messiah to come at some point. Paul comes in, overrides their story, and says
he was crucified.
Yes, he was already crucified up in the heavens, and if he's paid for your sins, he's still coming back, but he was crucified first. But in that mix, he's moving away from the Mosaic legalism. The Qumran community does not like him for doing that, and you're saying that it's possible that they murdered him to shut him up, to get rid of the problem once and for all. Turn to the mafia tactics, just to give him some concrete galoshes and stick him in the river. So now he's gone, but now they need to cover it up, so they make up a story about a historical Jesus. Is that what you're saying might have occurred?
Yeah, okay. Exactly.
I think the thing that I question though is, like, when they make up this story about Jesus, and I know there's ways to answer this question that could work, but like, don't you think people would have said, "You're telling us that Jesus was just crucified. He was crucified right there on outside of Jerusalem, but like none of us saw it. None of us know about it." If they were trying to come up with this and saying this was a historical event, this really happened, there were witnesses all over it, all kinds of crazy stuff happened, and it was all theoretically made up, but they tried to sell it to everybody. This really happened, whether it was based on their murder of Paul or something else, or just pure fiction. Don't you think people would have said, like, "What are you talking about? I live here. I've never seen that. I live right in this area you're referring to. This didn't happen." How do you think they sold this story if it was fiction? How do you think they sold it to people? Or was it just one of those things where at some point, the people in power said, "Believe it or die," and that was it?
Well, of course, communications were a lot slower. But anyway, I think the first gospel wasn't written until the late 90s. So this is
a generation or two after.
Yeah. It looks like to me that Mark has used Josephus and the Antiquities of the Jews, which wasn't written until 92 or 93 CE. And if he did use that as a source, one of his sources, then this stuff had been over for 40 or 50 years.
So there'd be no one around to really verify it at that point.
And if the Jerusalem apostles, the Qumran community, actually fled Jerusalem during the Roman War of 66 to 70. I think, I didn't include this in the book, and I think Robert Eisenman actually suggests this also, that the Qumran community fled Jerusalem either in 70 or at the Bar Kokhba revolt in 136 or 134, whenever that happened. They went to Arabia, and Qumran Judaism morphs into Islam over 500 years. It's the beginning of it's actually, there's a large Jewish community in Medina, I think. Now, there's no way to figure that out. There's no historical record. Islam has gotten rid of all the historical records. But anyway, I think it's so long after the supposed events of 36 or whenever, it's 70 years later maybe, and oh well, I guess that did happen, and you're trying to convince Greeks who'd never been to Jerusalem. So I assume that's what went on.
Well, I do have just a couple real quick final questions, because I know I've kept it for a while, but this one's going to be a little bit off the wall, but I just want to bounce it off you anyway. Do you think there's any chance that Paul and Josephus are the same person?
Paul and Josephus. I never thought of that. That never occurred to me.
Okay. No worries. Didn't mean to put you on the spot.
I can't read Greek well enough to see whether their styles are. Now, in my book, The Pauline Letters, a rhetorical analysis, I show that the letters of Paul are divided into literary units, and they're either chiastic or parallel, usually. About half of them are chiastic structured, and about half of them are parallel structured. There's some oddballs in there. But I doubt if Josephus wrote in chiastic structures, but you could try to match their styles and see if they're the same style. But that's the way I can tell what's interpolated into Paul and what's not, because the chiasms don't fit. All of a sudden, you could take out a section. Oh, now it fits.
Right.
But anyway.
Well, the final question then, and this is more going back big picture. I'm always like, okay, now that we've kind of dug into some details and said maybe this happened, maybe that happened, who knows? But it's fascinating to zoom out a little bit. And this will be my final question, but some people have looked at the fact that there is so much esoteric stuff going on in early Christianity, so much, really bizarre stuff with the Gnostics, stuff with Mary Magdalene, crazy stories that just elaborate that some of this stuff has to do with the Zodiac. Bill Darlison, who wrote the Zodiac and the Gospel, showing that the Gospel of Mark is structured according to the signs of the Zodiac in the right order. They begin to ask this question, like, what is happening here? And I know you're conjecturing this could be the story of Paul's life and of his eventual murder. But do you think there's any possibility that the Gospel of Mark is a story of what you might call the celestial journey of the soul? That these are people saying, you're not supposed to look at Jesus and say, what did Jesus do? You're supposed to look at Jesus and see yourself in his story and see him as your archetype and say, just like he did these things, and maybe not just Mark, but the Gospels as a whole, or at least the Synoptics, that you're supposed to see yourself as this is your soul's journey, and eventually he goes to heaven, you're going to go to heaven, you're going to ascend, but you need to, just like he went through his suffering and he learned obedience to God's plan, you're going to have to learn obedience to the suffering that God has for you, and then you also will ascend. Do you think that kind of esoteric Gnostic interpretation is possible? Or do you think this is just a story of somebody? It was Jesus's real story, or it was a story about Paul or whatever it was. This was an actual character. They meant for you to see this as whether it was a play or something. They meant you to see it as a story to read and enjoy the story, not to read yourself into it. Do you think which one do you think is more possible?
Well, with all great literature, you can read it on different levels. And Mark was a genius at that, in writing in different levels. And he writes this stuff and it looks simple and it looks like bad Greek. And he can't possibly be very sophisticated because he can't write Greek very well, according to the people who know. I can't read Greek, so I don't know that much. But I really have not looked at the celestial connection and the zodiac and stuff like that. I've seen references to it and all these different authors, but I've spent so much time doing other stuff. I never got into it. But I do think that on the allegorical level, Mark's character of Jesus has a crisis of trying to figure out if he should have faith in God, that if he submits to the crucifixion, he will be resurrected. And that's shown in his prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane. Take this cup from me. No, I don't want to do this. But your will, not mine. And so he eventually submits to the crucifixion. He has the requisite faith in God, and that's what Mark is trying to get across at that level of looking at it. You are supposed to emulate yourself after this character and have faith, and the ultimate faith is that if you die, you're going to heaven. You'll be resurrected. So I think yes, Mark is on that level. But then there's another level that you look at and you see this is a fictional allegory, and it's based on the Old Testament and based on the letters of Paul. And there's another level that you can see the wisdom of Jesus's sayings in the parable parable documents and things like that. So it's on multiple different levels. He was an absolute genius, that whoever wrote Mark.
Yeah, agreed. I wondered too, with how much they're copying from the Old Testament and Jesus in so many ways mimicking ancient Israel. I wondered at times if it was somebody's attempt to basically make a prediction, like a prophecy, to say, just like this Jesus character that you read about has gone through these different stages and he's gone through it, but eventually gets completely elevated to heaven. True Israel, the true followers of Yahweh, we are like, this story is us, but our future does include, we're going to be going through immense suffering, but God will resurrect us as a nation. I wondered at times if it's a national allegory, but at the end of the day, no one knows for sure. Maybe there was multiple rationales behind it. I do think the zodiac stuff is fascinating too. Like, just wondering who would have picked up when Jesus says, go look for a man with carrying a water pitcher to go to the upper room. Like, anyone that knows the zodiac would be like, oh, I know exactly what we're talking about. That's Aquarius. Like, and that stuff, it just pops at you all throughout Mark. All kinds of crazy things. Jesus walking on water, riding on a donkey. Like, these are all well-known zodiac signs. And so you do wonder, like, were they writing for the elite? Because the hoi polloi wouldn't have probably picked up on all that stuff, but they wouldn't have written it just to have nobody know what they're saying. They would have wanted somebody to be able to know this is, I see what you did there. That's cool. I see what you did there. So it makes you wonder whether they're writing for the elite or who they're writing for. And it's obviously all conjecture, but I do appreciate your voice in this, because you're bringing some great points up, and just at the end of the day, none of us know. It's all conjecture, and I think we can be very good friends with our atheist friends who think Jesus was a real historical character. We can be friends and have a beer and not argue and fuss and fight and call each other names. But I appreciate the fact that you bring great questions up, and it's an honor to be able to speak with you about this stuff.
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed it, Tim.
Yeah. Did you have any fun? I know kind of asked most of my questions already, but did you have any final thoughts you wanted to add before we finish?
No, I think you covered it pretty well.
Okay, cool. Well, thank you so much. Let me bring your book back here to wrap us up. So everyone, please check out David Oliver Smith's book, The Bible Tells Me So, and his other books. I have the link beneath our video for Amazon. Thank you so much. Great to hear your story and great to hear your insights. And I definitely look forward to doing it again. I will be reading your books, all of them, in great detail shortly. So thank you for all your research. It's just an honor, and you're definitely giving us some meat to chew on.
Thank you very much, Tim. I enjoyed it myself.
Great. Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Bye.